We know what the future of warfare is supposed to look like. Powerful robots and other machines, relentless and deadly, but also kind of slow, following the same sort of battlefield strategies that a human being would. The point is that the human forces of goodness have a chance if they're brave enough, if they're smart enough, if a movie's big budget enough. They can work it out, survive, maybe even win. That's not what it's going to look like. The rules of war are about to change big time. The powers that have had military superiority for the last few decades have no guarantee that they're going to keep it. It's not time to panic or anything like that, but it is time to have a sober look at what's coming down the pipeline at us. So this video is about the future of warfare, the things we should be getting ready for, some of which we are so totally unprepared for, it's not funny. Some things will stay broadly the same about warfare. Planes may get faster, missiles more powerful and more accurate. These are just degrees of improvement. But two things are going to be very different. One, how the enemy destroys you without fighting, and two, how quickly and what actually does happen on the battlefield. We're seeing the early foreshadowing of these changes on the battlefield in Ukraine, but nothing like what's coming next. So part 1, destroyed without fighting. In 2007, there was an experiment being conducted in Idaho. The government had a massive electrical generator set up in an 890 square mile piece of land, where Idaho National Laboratory had an experimental power grid set up. And the challenge was to see what damage could be done, if any, by saboteurs or adversaries to American infrastructure. Security expert Mike Asante had fed into what was codenamed Aurora, which aimed to use computer hacking to attack a piece of energy infrastructure, something that had never been done before. Asante was particularly focused on what's called the protective relay. These are safety mechanisms, and it works like this. If a generator goes out of sync, the protective relay detects that and opens a circuit breaker. This should isolate the problem and protect the overall system. At 11:33 AM, they kicked off a hacking attack that got access to the relay and injected just 30 lines of computer code. And it only did one thing, which was to flip the logic of what the relay was supposed to be doing. So at 11:33 plus 23 seconds, it noted that the generator was perfectly synced to the grid at 60 Hz, which normally means that it just leaves it alone, but the opposite logic applied. So it chose that moment to disconnect it from the grid. Once it was detached, the generator started to instantly accelerate because it was no longer sharing its power with the grid. And as soon as the relay had seen that it was now out of sync with the grid, that's the moment it chose to reconnect it. Rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat. So look, that sounds annoying, but how much damage could that do, realistically? The watching audience, made up of government and industry officials, saw the generator shaking with massively violent forces. Chunks began to fly out of the panel as the black rubber grommet that linked parts of the generator shaft were being torn apart. A few seconds again, the relay repeated the sabotage cycle, disconnecting and reconnecting the machine. By now, smoke was beginning to emerge. Within another minute or two, the generator was completely destroyed. This was the first proof of concept. Hackers with just a few lines of code could take out a piece of energy infrastructure. That was then, and we've seen this in action since in Ukraine and other places. The Russian hacking group known as Sandworm spent half a decade quietly getting into systems, particularly industrial control systems, involved in energy infrastructure. After initially hitting a few other companies in Ukraine, media companies and the like, they moved on to taking down the power grid in the west of the country. This footage, taken by engineers at the time, shows one incident where the hackers operated the computer cursor to open circuit breakers to bring down the power. That was a trial run. In 2017, the hackers gained control of a server run by an accountancy software company, and it infected the automatic software update process that was used to patch all of their customers' software. Therefore, they infected all of those customers with a piece of malware that then sat and waited for instructions for when to attack. The malware became known as NotPetya, and it ripped across the world at rapid speed, destroying data and locking up machines. Ukraine was hit hard, the entire government was pushed offline, but it spread far and wide. Railways, airports, the post office. Within hours, it had then spread beyond Ukraine. Pharmaceutical giant Merck, which reported it lost 15,000 Windows computers in just 90 seconds. FedEx in Europe, TNT Express, Cadbury, Mondelez, Reckitt Benckiser, it hit them all, and it caused hundreds of millions in damages. In 2013, an article based on a speech by the Chief of Staff of the Russian military, General Valery Gerasimov, said this: "In the 21st century, we have seen a tendency towards blurring the lines between the states of war and peace. Wars are no longer declared, and having begun, proceed according to an unfamiliar template." And he talked about how this new form of war could be fought and won. And he included the following: reduction of the military economic potential of the state by the destruction of critically important facilities of its military and civilian infrastructure in a short time. The FBI and DHS confirmed that starting in 2016, Russian hackers had been progressively targeting American critical infrastructure, including water, energy, and let's not forget nuclear facilities. In some cases, they said, the hackers penetrated deep and reached industrial control systems. They hadn't pulled the trigger, but they had been in a position to do that if that's what they'd wanted to do. Here's the thing. Ukraine got good at handling this. It got good at rebooting power stations that had been taken down. Because they'd been used as the testing ground by the hackers, they developed pretty good expertise in containing and recovering from those attacks. And their power stations were relatively manually operated, They could be disconnected from computer systems and rebooted quite quickly. That is not, however, a description of the more sophisticated and automated critical infrastructure in most Western countries. If a hacking attack took down an American or a British power plant, it could be hugely more complicated and time-consuming to recover from that. When Putin's army first attacked Ukraine, his hackers preceded the attack by trying to disrupt all the information systems. Now, they were largely unsuccessful, precisely because the Ukrainians had been so well trained by them being used as a testbed. And now the war is fully in progress. Of course, it's cheaper and quicker for them just to bomb the power plants, old school military style. But America and Britain are used to fighting wars that mostly happen elsewhere. But keeping the consequences away from their own people, in the future, that's not going to be so easy to do. Which is one part. But what about when war actually does break out? Well, that brings us to part 2, how the battlefield is going to be transformed. And that brings us to a discussion of artificial intelligence. Now, you might have heard a lot about AI in recent months. There's been a lot of discussion about AI-powered chatbots and digital art creators and all sorts. But before we got to any of those, one of the first things we realised is that we could use this to revolutionise strategy. And it started with one of the first dramatic breakthroughs that first gave us a hint that AI was coming to the party. Up until the start of the 2010s, the power of computers really came from the vast reservoir of data that we could put at their disposal. So you could have a chess computer that could draw upon thousands of years of all human recorded chess experience. If a human being had done it in the past, and it had worked, the computer knew about it and could utilize it. That sounds good, But in 2010, we started taking it to a whole new level.
What we're really waiting for is the kind of computer to which you can give a problem and then leave it to work out the answer all by itself.
The startup company DeepMind was bought by Google.
Let's start with the biggest news of the day, Sasha. That's Google buying DeepMind for $400 million, maybe $500 million. DeepMind is an artificial intelligence research company that not a lot of people know about, but everyone in the tech space has been going after in the last 6 months.
And it created a program called AlphaGo. AlphaGo is a program that would play the complex and fiendishly difficult Chinese strategy game Go. One version beat the world champion Go player 3-0. Then they designed another version that was completely different in one important way. AlphaGo Zero. Instead of giving it that database of all of those historical human games, they simply gave it a system to be able to teach itself from scratch. They gave it the rules, they gave it the conditions, and then just let it get on with it. AlphaGo Zero learned by playing itself, which is wild. Just trying out all of the millions of different possibilities and seeing what would work the best. But here's the really wild part. It took it just 70 hours to get to the same level as the previous software that was using the whole wealth of all human history on that game. Then they made a second version that had a larger network, but they gave that one just 40 hours. That one ended up at the point where it beat the most advanced version of the previous software 90% of the time. Take a moment to chew over that for a moment. It taught itself to be better than a program that had all of the records of human gameplay to draw from, and it did so using completely new strategies that no human player had ever even discovered. And that's not even the spookiest part. The fact is, we don't know what it did to get that smart. We created a system that was better than the wealth of all human knowledge on a particular niche. The best the human race could do was holding it back. Ouch! And we don't even know how it works. Now you might say, well, okay, but it's just a game. What's that got to do with the topic of this video? Until you start wondering, what would it look like if you applied the same learning process to battlefield strategy, to geopolitical dominance strategy? Supposing there you could come up with winning plays beyond what human beings have ever discovered in the past. And now suppose being on the receiving end of that, if the other side did it and your side didn't. So yes, the war in Ukraine has shown us how drones can become a lower cost way of delivering destructive power, but it's as we're coming into the age of AI-powered autonomous weapons that things are really going to shift to the next level. Know who takes this seriously? China. The government there recently committed $2 billion for an AI technology park in Beijing to house 400 companies. Amongst a lot else besides. They are some way on this journey. And some of it is exactly the sort of thing that we have imagined it would be.
Voice key incorrect.
Here's the real life version. Spy bird drones. They look and they move like real birds to avoid radar and human detection. So wait, you're actually in a submarine? No problem. Better watch out for this bad boy then. Fish and shark drones that swim realistically in the ocean. They would be pretty hard to detect, for instance by American and British ships in the South China Sea, just as an example. According to military analysts, the United States looks towards the use of AI in military technology as a tool to use against human armies on the battlefield, using the new systems to do old-style warfare better, in other words. Indeed, not exactly like this, but sort of like this. China's emphasis instead is to paralyze the adversary by attacking their systems, disrupting their ability to gain intelligence, and to mobilize resources.
Which quoted this Mandiant group, traced this latest outbreak of cyber warfare to this building in Shanghai, a 12-story building.
Cyber hacking, a major source of friction between the U.S. and China.
We'd probably see cyber attacks, both on military networks, but also here at home. could cause disruption. Rail networks, air transportation, communications, etc. The idea is to paralyze your adversary and then hit them hard physically.
Consider how many possible ways a self-learning AI could come up with to cripple an advanced technological society. Around the edge of the Ukraine war, it was noticed that Russian vessels were paying attention to the undersea cables that give Britain internet connectivity to the rest of the world. Similar things have been seen in relation to satellites. Well, suppose the UK and/or the US got taken off the internet early as a conflict was escalating. Now, the military systems would find some way around it. I mean, the internet was created in the first instance by DARPA as a system that could survive a nuclear attack. But just about every system used by civilian populations would die. It would make the Russian bombing of Ukrainian power stations seem like a little bit of light interference in comparison. Now, the US has some disadvantages in all of this equation, not least because in the West, it has largely outsourced the generation of AI to private corporations. And some of the American private corporations don't actually like working for the military. So, for instance, the Department of Defense contracted with Google to help develop the AI capabilities they needed for a thing called Project Maven, systems that would analyze drone footage. Google employees weren't told that they were working on a military project. When they found out, there was a huge internal backlash that quickly spilled out into public view, by which I mean 4,000 Google employees took out a full-page advert in the New York Times to complain about it. Ultimately, Google caved and said that it would not renew its contract with the Department of Defense. That is something of a challenge to the US trying to keep up with this new arms race. In the US, the worry that an AI could end up spiraling out of control has led to the US doctrine that says that any AI must always have a human being kept in the loop. We do not want the machine making life and death decisions.
You just can't go around killing people.
Why?
Now, I think that's a good moral choice, in principle. We've seen all sorts of unintended consequences from the early day of AI. What happens when a system takes the instruction too literally or doesn't understand a piece of context? But by all reports, that is not the attitude in China. They are so worried about falling behind in AI development that they want as few obstacles to the process as possible. And its vision for how the battlefield may change is that it should aim for the achievement of a singularity. The singularity is where human beings can no longer keep up with the speed and tempo of how decisions are being made by machines on the battlefield. So you're not going to have much choice. You either put your AI completely in charge, or the war's going to be over before you even know what happened. This is not the world of the Terminators pacing ponderously across the landscape. It could be the world where 1,000 mini drones get dropped over the battle zone, or over government buildings of the country, each of them programmed to find one human each to kill, maybe with a top priority list of the most important ones to assassinate. Maybe with a totally different game plan altogether. Maybe one that I could never anticipate, because the computers come up with a strategy that's never occurred to a human being. By the time we've figured it out, way too late. Now, all of that is serious and it is real, but we are not yet at the worst case scenario. There's good reason to think that we never will be. China may be very focused on this, but there's no doubt that Beijing would prefer to meet its political objectives without resorting to the battlefield. Because every single time a war is fought, obviously there is a huge cost to be paid, even when you're the winner. In the last century, we happened upon a weapon, the nuclear bomb, that was so devastating. Everyone realised that it put them into a losing position, whether they won such a war or not. You could win a nuclear war and all of your people would die anyway, or at the very least those that survived would envy the dead. The question is whether the age of autonomous AI puts us into yet another position where that same logic applies. And if so, whether we'll have a sense to work out that our strategy should be to prevent it ever being used by either side. because the first time it is, it's really going to take us to a place where we just collectively do not want to go.